Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich, online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Off the Beaten Path, Wandering in the Zhuangzi. Yo is a special word in the Zhuangzi. It may be roughly translated as wandering or roaming, and we've already come across it in the happy fish story. We saw that yo is used to describe Zhuangzi and Huizi strolling on the bridge above the river Hao, as well as the fishes swimming in the waters beneath the bridge. That analogy between the experience of the fish and the experience of the men gestures towards the possibility of taking on different perspectives, and this is precisely what Zhuangzi does when he notes that the fish are happy. And why shouldn't they be, given that it's quite pleasant to wander? It can be liberating to travel without any destination, and the Zhuangzi shows awareness of that feeling. But it isn't interested only in aimless wandering. Many characters in the text are doing things, engaging in the activities of everyday life, not least the protagonists of these so-called skill stories. The Zhuangzi wants us to develop and exercise initiative, not just blithely go with the flow. That goes hand in hand with its focus on responding to changing circumstances, or, as the Zhuangzi would put it, the transformations of the world. The skill stories emphasize a range of capacities we have, some of which can be developed to allow us to engage more fruitfully. It's also clear that, for these masters, being attentive and responsive is something we can develop only when we are actively engaged. In this episode, we reflect on what this means by focusing on some aspects of agency and philosophical transformation in the Zhuangzi. These themes arise in a story we haven't yet discussed, but that brings together two features of the Zhuangzi we have discussed in depth: the use of Confucius as a character and the attention to skillful action. In this story, Confucius, or Kongzi, Master Kong, has set out to scrutinize the waterfall. It plummets several hundred feet, whitening the waters for 40 miles around, and is impassable to fishes and turtles. Whereas the Taoists tended to see water as representing nourishment and adaptability, in the Confucian tradition, water is a symbol of loyalty and trustworthiness. So presumably, Kongzi has set out to reflect on these characteristics of water in order to cultivate his virtue. He's a man on a mission in this natural setting, unlike in the story of the cicada catcher, when he just happened to be passing through the forest. Kongzi has a terrible fright as he approaches the waterfall. He sees a man in the roiling waters at the base of the cascades and takes this to be a suicide attempt. He hurries with his followers to pull the man out. Yet the man emerges from the water, singing, hair streaming down. Kongzi runs after him and cries, "I thought you were a ghost, but now I see you are a man. Do you have a Tao that allows you to tread the waters?" To which the swimmer replies, "I have no Tao," which should surprise us. Why is the swimmer unlike the other skilled masters who do have Tao? The swimmer explains that he follows the Tao of the water, without creating a Tao of his own. That would be counterproductive because it is dangerous for any swimmer to have any methods or plans when engulfed in the water. Let's take a step back. Kongzi had a reason to be at the waterfall and encounters the swimmer only by chance. Deflected from his mission, he is at a loss to understand what is happening. Both he and the swimmer are attempting to respond to the waters, but they do so in very different ways. Being guided by Confucian practices of cultivation, Kongzi seeks to reflect on certain qualities of the water by scrutinizing it through that lens. By contrast, the swimmer lets himself be guided by the water, going along with its Tao with no preconceived plans or methods. Kongzi's reaction shows just how deeply entrenched he is in his own perspective. The waters are fearsome and threatening, a person in them can only be attempting suicide, and no one can survive in it, so the man must be a ghost. Very different is the swimmer's mode of responsiveness, which he himself describes as follows. It all starts out in the given, grows through inborn nature, and comes to perfection in destiny. I enter into the navels of the whirlpools and emerge with the surging eddies. I just follow the Tao of the water without creating a Tao of my own. This is how I tread the waters. The swimmer does not approach the waters on the basis of what is constructed in human impressions, He aligns with what is given through developing his nature and regards this as his destiny. That development begins from a point before the human imposition of order upon the world. He isn't someone who has a plan, but can adapt that plan if necessary. Rather, he's someone who starts out without any fixed plan at all. Which is not to say that he starts as a blank slate. The swimmer says that he was born among the hills and felt safe there. This, he says, is what was given. But he later gravitated toward the water, and as he says, I came to feel safely at home in the water. That was my inborn nature. And to be thus and so without knowing how or why I am thus and so, that's destiny. Again, the contrast to Zhuangzi could hardly be more vivid. Rather than setting out to shape or develop his inborn nature with a certain goal in mind, the swimmer was open to the environments, first of the hills and then of the waters. He quite literally let that environment show him the way. So the swimmer is, in some senses, including the most literal sense, going with the flow. But that suggests a passivity that would be out of place here. There's one decision the swimmer has actively made, namely that in treading water, he should simply respond to it. In this respect, the passage resonates with the story of Qing the woodcarver, who made beautiful bell stands. Just as Qing apprehends the nature of the trees without any preconceptions, the swimmer seeks simply to match the Tao of the water. We do not get another mention here of matching heaven with heaven, as in the woodcarver story, but the point seems to be the same, namely that we should strive for an engaged and intentional response to the world. One aspect of that intentionality is the swimmer's reflective attitude on his own Tao in relation to the water's Tao. The swimmer isn't giving up control of the situation, and we might even say that he does have a plan. It's just that his plan is to have no fixed plan. The scholar David Velleman has suggested that consummate agency in the Zhuangzi requires no such higher-order reflection. He emphasizes the idea of becoming so engrossed in an activity that we stop reflecting and lose ourselves. This seems right, but only to some extent. Like the protagonists of the other skill stories, the swimmer may well be just acting in the moment as he displays his mastery. While he's in the water, he doesn't need to think actively about his life story, destiny, the Tao of the water, and so on. But he can explain these things to Zhuangzi once he's out on the riverbank. Likewise, the masters in the other skill stories display a self-conscious attitude towards their own mastery. They know that they are attentively aligning themselves with the world as it is, the heavenly. So, the Zhuangzi does value conscious consideration about how we act in the world. Even if we wander aimlessly, we do so intentionally and for good reason. The very first story in the Zhuangzi, about Peng, the giant bird, and the cicada and the little dove, speaks to us about wandering too. It is, after all, in a chapter entitled Carefree Wandering. The two little creatures simply cannot think beyond their own experiences, yet they do show some degree of self-knowledge, in that they know about their own flying capacities. They understand what they're capable of, but not what they're not capable of. They're unable to wander with Peng, to imagine possibilities beyond the life they lead. This is the key theme in the Zhuangzi's conception of wandering. It concerns contemplating ways of life and pursuits that are different from one's own. That begins with the realization and acceptance that there are other possibilities. Sadly, the cicada and little dove cannot accept that. Similarly limited are the monkeys in a story we mentioned briefly in episode 44. Their keeper offers them 3 nuts in the morning and 4 in the evening, a proposition to which they react with indignation. He suggests giving them 4 in the morning and 3 in the evening, which makes them happy again. The obvious point here is that the monkeys are making a fuss about a difference that doesn't matter. It's 7 nuts either way. So as the Zhuangzi comments, the arrangement brought the monkeys no loss either in name or in fact, but in one case it brought anger, and in another delight. But more significant is the role played by the keeper of the monkeys. Adopting a higher order perspective, he grasps that he can succeed by going along with the monkey's preference, even if the preference makes no sense. He responds flexibly and thus exemplifies the characteristics of a sage. As the story puts it, he remains at rest in the middle of the heavenly potter's wheel. The image of the wheel expresses constant rotation, never being fixed in one place. But unlike the monkeys or the cicada and the little dove, or indeed Zhuangzi in some of the stories where he appears, sages never cling rigidly to just one view, insisting that they alone are right and denying all others. Their flexibility can even extend to accommodating the inflexibility of others, their being wedded to xu fei or black and white thinking. Thus, Chris Fraser has written that in the story about the monkeys, the keeper's adaptive shu aims at adjusting shu-fei distinctions so as to harmonize the values and practices of interacting parties. Similarly, Wim de Roy has written, "What determines the monkey keeper's final judgment is simply the prospect of conflict. Faced with the monkey's anger, he adopts a flexible approach and adapts his judgment to the concrete circumstances." The story of the monkeys closes by saying that the sage who takes their position on the heavenly potter's wheel may also be said to be walking two roads. Again, the idea of higher-order reflection could help us understand this. The monkeys want to follow one road, and the monkey keeper goes along with this, but even as he does so, he's following a second road, which is his awareness that the monkey's way is just one way, and not the only way. We can take this to represent the contrast between two attitudes. One is the usual human approach of shu-fei thinking, while the other is the path less traveled, the heavenly path that involves reflecting on those merely human attitudes. To see them as limited is not necessarily to reject them, but it is to see them as merely one perspective in which the sage would never become entrenched. This means that Zhuangzi sages have dual positionality. In being responsive to circumstances, they may take a Dao that is staunchly defended by someone else. At the same time, they're aware that this is not a permanent Dao, not the last word on the subject. This way the sage is detached from hard and fast views reminds us of the modern-day philosopher Thomas Nagel and his discussion of philosophical absurdity. Nagel notes that when doing philosophy, we often aim to seek justification for our values and pursuits. Instead, we ought to take a step back and ask why we value the things we do. Why do we care that we should try to leave a smaller environmental footprint, for example? Out of concern for our own children, or for future generations in general, or for the planet Earth itself? But then one might ask, why should we care about any of these matters? If one keeps pushing back this question of justification, Nagel says, we arrive at the point of realizing that there's nothing there to provide a firm foundation to justify what we hold dear. This leads to a situation of a specifically philosophical absurdity, which Nagel describes as follows. The whole system of justification and criticism, which controls our choices and supports our claims to rationality, rests on responses and habits that we never question, that we should not know how to defend without circularity, and to which we shall continue to adhere even after they are called into question. Philosophical absurdity lies in our both seeing that we cannot provide ultimate justification for our beliefs and, nevertheless, carrying on in our lives as if there was some such justification. This resonates with what the Zhuangzi's monkey keeper is doing. Traveling along one road, he's aware that we cannot provide a rationale that grounds shu-fei assertions, like the ones made by the monkeys, but along the other road, he's content simply to go along with the monkey's demand. This returns us to the question of whether the Zhuangzi is a relativist text. As before, we would conclude that it is not. Responding with conscious and intentional flexibility doesn't mean just going along with everything one encounters. It involves having a higher-order perspective that sees inflexible views as situated and transient. The key to walking two roads is to have that detachment from entrenched views, an attitude that is compatible with both accepting and rejecting them. The Zhuangzi's wandering is only aimless from the point of view of those who think there is only one right aim. But if this isn't a relativist stance, it's still an ironic one. It involves sometimes going along with views one doesn't necessarily accept for oneself. Again, this is something highlighted by Nagel. Having become aware of philosophical absurdity, we needn't despair at our inability to place our values firmly upon some foundation. He notes that even if we have no reason to believe that anything matters, then that doesn't matter either, and we can approach our absurd lives with irony instead of heroism or despair. The Zhuangzi's walking two roads helps us understand how irony works, going about life, but in a detached way. The authors of the text would probably agree that ironic awareness of absurdity is one of the most human things about us, a manifestation of our most advanced and interesting characteristics, as Nagel puts it, something that is possible only because we possess a certain kind of insight, the capacity to transcend ourselves in thought. Being engaged in living life and appreciating how we have the capacities necessary to navigate it may be understood as a transformative experience, a revised understanding of how we stand in relation to our values and practices. The Zhuangzi celebrates the human capacity to wander, along with possibilities beyond what is found with one's experiences. It is something that Kongzi, the cicada and the little dove, and the monkeys cannot enjoy, but that the swimmer did, coming down from the hills to immerse himself in the turbulent waters and learn to find ease and safety in them. This is why the Zhuangzi is deeply concerned about other political visions of its day. These rob humans of their capacity to exercise initiative in their engagements with the world. Confucians and Moists cling to one way of life that they see as correct, a policy that can never lead to the equanimity of someone like the swimmer or the monkey keeper. Or think too of Zhuangzi himself. When his wife died, he at first wept, but then found a perspective from which he could maintain composure, even joy. To live like that, one needs to follow the road less traveled. With that, we've just about finished with the Zhuangzi, meaning that we're almost ready to move on to another school of thought that seems very different, legalism. Where the Zhuangzi exhorts us to adopt flexibility, legalists like Han Feizi are notorious for being inflexible, even brutal and callous. We'll have to decide whether that reputation is deserved, but first we want to take a step back of our own and speak to a leading expert on the Zhuangzi in a discussion that will return to a few of the themes we've discussed, along with some others that haven't come up yet. It would be absurd if you passed up on the chance to hear our interview with Hans-Georg Müller here on the History of Philosophy in China.